Hey everybody, CyberTal back with you. This is going to be our final game in our review of how to play against hanging pawns. We'll make it a good one. This is one last game from, I would say, the greatest positional squeezer of all time, Tigran Petrosian. He has the white pieces against Petrosian-Suetin, who's a strong Soviet player, certainly not to the level of Petrosian and that tier of players, but he was always involved in the Soviet championships and other strong tournaments like that. This game in 1954. Petrosian was white, started with c4. Petrosian loved to play against the King's Indian, and this is the opening that we're going to see from the black side today. Two of my favorite quotes from Petrosian. He said this about both the King's Indian and the Dutch, but he said something like, if you know your opponent is about to play one of these openings, for God's sake, don't stop them. And I'm always happy to see the King's Indian. It feeds my family. And when you look at the character of the King's Indian, and we'll get to that position straight away, you can understand why Petrosian was a fan of playing against the King's Indian. Petrosian was very much a classical positional player. There are very few openings from the white side where black allows you to set up this kind of broad center, with pawns on c4, d4, and e4. Even fairly hyper-modern openings like the Queen's Indian, Nimzo Indian. Black is challenging for the center to try to prevent e4 or d4, or some other pawn push. In the King's Indian, this is the most radical of the hypermodern openings, in my opinion, because black just allows everything. In fact, white can play f4 here if he wants to, where he's established the broadest center possible. And then black takes it upon himself to counterattack the center, or gain counterplay on the king side, or what have you. So for a classical player like Petrosian, in certain respects I'm a fairly positional player as well, playing against the King's Indian is more or less what you're looking for. You want to play with that edge in space. You want to play with that increased scope to squeeze your opponent down. It's really just a matter of taste. One thing about the King's Indian, when you look at the King's Indian with an engine, it positively hates black's position, basically at all times. So it actually makes it fairly difficult to use an engine to prepare King's Indian theory. Because if you're just going by engine evaluation, which can be dangerous in some respects, it just always says that black has a terrible position. But when you look at the practical results, King's Indian scores virtually as well as any other major opening. If nothing else, because of the tactical complications that black gains. Black always has some kind of trick or bit of tactical nonsense to get out of trouble in the King's Indian. Vladimir Kramnik, my personal favorite player, is of the opinion that the King's Indian is essentially unsound, but it always has some sort of tactical nonsense to stay out of practical trouble, which I think more or less is true. I wouldn't necessarily say it's intrinsically unsound, but what do I know? So this is the basic position of the King's Indian. Petrosian played bishop e2, which is fitting with his character. He was a very positional classical player, so bishop e2 is very much a positional classical move, developing and getting on with life. We looked at f4. This is the 4 pawns attack. This is just straight out gobbling up all the center that you can. Downside, this is heavily theoretical, and black has analyzed a lot of ways to get equality out of this. So if black knows what he's doing, playing the 4 pawns really isn't going to have much of an impact. And in some ways, it's exactly what black is looking for. Black is, when he plays the King's Indian, presumably looking for a sharp, tactical, uncompromising fight. f4 gives black exactly that. This is going to be a very sharp, concrete battle. What system I'm a big fan of? h3. This is Makaganov. Takes the g4 square into custody, so black can't play bishop g4 or knight g4. But it's different in the same-ish, in that white's retaining the ability to play f4 in one go, which is sort of an increase in flexibility. Now, it takes away a right for white to play h4 in one go, but in general, playing h4 isn't as common in the King's Indian as playing moves like f4 and g4. Also, white retains flexibility with this knight in g1. He doesn't commit it to f3. So white retains the option to play something like g4, knight e2, and knight g3. And all of this is designed to lock down on black's pawn break on f5, which is, when you play the King's Indian, breaking with f5 is more or less your long-term goal in most positions. So h3 is sort of long-term target against black's main pawn break. So not necessarily better than other systems, just interesting in my opinion. But bishop e2, this is fine. Knight f3, this is the main move by a long stretch. Bishop g5, this would be the Oberbach. So white leaves this knight on g1 for now. The bishop on g2 is preventing, or the bishop on e2 is preventing both knight g4 and knight h5. So it's a little bit harder for this knight to get out of the way for the pawn break. Also, it's preventing e5, which is one of the main King's Indian ideas. Of course, here, e5 would just flat out lose. It's important tactical justification. White's winning material. Most common is c5 here. And this is going to head towards a modern Bayonet structure, most likely. So this is just another way of playing. Knight f3, it's the most popular, it's the most classical. e5, d5. So this is the Petrosian variation. This was considered a little bit offbeat when he first started introducing this back in the 50s. The King's Indian had really started to be developed in the 30s and 40s. Bronstein and Boleslavsky were really the ones that get the King's Indian train going, and then players like Geller came along and sort of added their stone to the theoretical cairn. The most common here, castle, knight c6, knight bd7 is another move, but knight c6 is the main. And then here we have two humongous branching points. b4 is what's called the Bayonet Attacks. So this was popularized by Kramnik in the 90s. White just immediately gets going with his Kingside attack. And this really got popular after Kramnik beat Kasparov a couple times in the King's Indian, where Kasparov was the best King's Indian player in the world at that time. Won beautiful attacking games with it. So to see Kramnik grinding him down with this opening sort of gave it a huge impetus. The other big option from here, this is a very historic opening. This is called the Mardel Plata. So this has a humongous presence in chess history. This is one of the first lines that was tried against the King's Indian at the top level. Basically, both sides, with this f4 push, both sides are locked into their plan. White's going to go on the queen side, and black's going to go on the king side. And they might occasionally take a timeout move, but it's really just going to be one attack versus the other, and whoever lands first wins. Both sides have sort of shied away from this. This has gotten so theoretically prohibitive. I mean, this has theory out to moves 30 or so. And it's all incredibly concrete. Like, there's no potential for deviation. You have to know your theory, which a lot of people are put off on, because it's just a game of analysis and computer warfare at that point. Plus the fact that black, in all of these lines, he's playing against the white king. So theoretically, white's queenside attack should be stronger, but black is playing for mate. So basically, any mistake by white tends to be of larger consequence, because if you queen a pawn on the queen side, checkmate still wins. So playing for mate just practically leads to better results, because checkmate ends the game. But d5 avoids a lot of this, and also tends to be a little bit more flexible in terms of white's approach. I quite like this line as white. Knight bd7, a5 is another choice. They should both transpose the same position. Castle. So this, I gave a dubious mark to. This might be a little bit unkind. Bishop g5 is the more precise incarnation of Petrosian's idea. One modern way of this position going, just to show it. Castle. And white scores really well here. Even though the engine actually likes black's position for once. I would assume it's because of the bishop pair. But this huge hole on f5 sort of demarcates white's positional hopes in this line. That is a huge hole in black's pawn structure, and white hopes to take advantage of it eventually. Another idea here that I wanted to draw attention to, if you're against the King's Indian as white, or if you play against it as black and you're needing something to prepare against, I think bishop e3 is very much underrated here. It is not nearly the most popular option, but I quite like this. So this is just a very straightforward move. So if black plays a pass move or like knight c5, basically white's positional threat is just to play knight d2. And this is the move that white ultimately wants to play, because now the knight's reinforcing e4, The bishop on e2 is preventing knight g4, so this bishop can't be harassed. And now white is just going to get on with his queenside advance. He's just threatening b4 here. This is exactly the setup that white wants for his minor pieces. So after bishop e3, knight g4 is forced, more or less. It's the only critical move. f6, and then this is the most played line against this, but I don't really find it convincing. And then f3. F5 is the most played, but I think f3 might be a little bit better. So, I like it. I very much like this position as white. This is a bit similar to the Mardel-Plata line. 1 point in white's favor is that white hasn't committed to kingside castling here. So if black closes the position with f4, white isn't forced to castle into it. He can just play queen c2 and then castle queenside. And with the queenside locked up, white could even consider a counterattack on the kingside by opening things up with g3 and h4. Or he could just continue the idea of a queenside push with like king b1, b4, c5. And because white controls all of the space in the queenside, it's harder for black to generate an attack over there. I quite like this line as white's. The fewer games that have reached this position, which is far less than most King's Indian lines, so it's a bit of an unexplored line. But white scores incredibly well from here, and it's easy to see why, because white controls the usual edge in space, but it's harder for black to generate counterplay because the white king hasn't committed itself yet. So I quite like this as white. This will probably be, if I ever played against the King's Indian, might be what I take up. Who knows? A castle, this is the early incarnation of Petrosian, so it's understandable there were some hiccups. Queen c2, so this is why this is a little bit less enjoyed for white these days, because the queen is forced to move to reinforce. White could play knight d2, but after a5, this bishop on c1 is very unhappy with the proceedings. So queen c2. Bishop g5, this is similar to the now modern main line of Petrosian, except the queen's been forced to waste a move with queen c2. So this is like a downgraded version of the modern line. Bishop e3, bishop h4 doesn't work. This is a very nice position for black. So bishop e3. Knight d7, so this is poor coordination for those knights. You sometimes see this. Now, black is getting out of the way for his pawn break of f5, so this is completely understandable. But the knights are sort of stepping on one another's toes now. b6 looks best, just reinforcing the c5 points. White's long-term main pawn break is c5 to open up the queen side, so this reinforcement move puts another barrier in the way of that long-term strategic goal for white. 2, I just give the main line. I want to turn this into a theoretical symposium. And I end my analysis here. I think white's a little bit more comfortable. It might just be biased because I enjoy playing against the King's Indian because I am sort of a boring positional player. But I think black can be happy with this as well. But the choice in the game, this is very awkward for black. F5, F3 I don't like. This just turns into a race where white doesn't need to turn into a race. Bishop F6, so I wanted to highlight this positional idea. If you haven't committed to G5 yet, a common idea for black in these lines is to play Bishop F6 and then Bishop F4, getting this dark square bishop off the board. That's white's good bishop. With all these pawns on light squares, this dark square bishop is especially important. Without that dark square bishop, it's much harder for white to achieve some of his positional goals. Sort of the reverse is true for black as well. Often that light square bishop is the key piece for any kingside attack for black. A lot of white players in these race situations will even sacrifice the exchange to get that light square bishop off the board just because it's such a key piece. But just give it a quick shorthand of this. Black seems comfortable here. Getting this dark square bishop off the board, G3 is just not an option. That's so weak to me. But without that dark square bishop on the board, it's hard to say that white will ever be better here. I don't think black's better, but this is a pretty comfortable position for black. So F5 I think is better. F4, I think F3 might be a little bit more comfortable, but this is positionally common. It's blockading the kingside pawn, so now F4 can't be played here. So it sort of keeps the kingside a little bit more safe. F4, this is probably force, just to demonstrate, e4 is exactly what white wants out of this position, because now these pawns are just completely locked up. And long term, white is the one with all the play, so he's going to maneuver his knight to d4, he's going to play king h1, and then at an appropriate time he's going to get the pawn break g4 in. And black really doesn't have any play of his own to balance this out, so taking an e4 is correct. 5, the knight gets that nice post on e5. Knight f3. So white's a little bit better here. So this pawn on f5 is certainly a weakness, and we're going to get to a hanging pawn structure here soon. But it's sort of a similar situation of a transition from an isolated pawn to a hanging pawn structure. This pawn on f5 is certainly a weakness, and it's not like an isolated queen pawn where it has compensatory factors. It does give us this outpost on e5, which is a strong place for the knight, but this is just a weak pawn, and the fact that it exposes black's kingside to have this pawn up here is sort of a double bonus for white that we see in some tactical lines later in the game. So white's a little bit better. This pawn, it's hard to attack this pawn on f5, but it's a weakness that isn't going anywhere. So queen f6, queen d2. This is inaccurate. Knight x e5 is a more accurate incarnation of what white's going for. And then we reach more or less the game position without giving black an opportunity here. So rook at e8, this is inaccurate. Knight takes f3, it avoids the hanging pawn structure, and it keeps this bishop on g7 active. Rook x f3, queen c2. And black is very comfortable here. This bishop on g7 is an absolute monster, and he doesn't have a pawn on e5 blocking that monstrous bishop up. The pawn on f5, it's still a theoretical weakness, so long term it's something that white will aim for, but right now it's not a weakness at all. And right now all black has is just very comfortable activity. This bishop on g7 by itself almost equalizes the position. Knight takes e5. So rook at e8 was a mistake because it allows white another bite at the apple. So transitioning to this hanging pawns. And what I wanted to do our last game with sort of a bit of variety, because we haven't gone over any kingside hanging pawns yet. A lot of the same principles apply, but the fact that the kings are each behind the hanging pawns add a bit more tactical complexity to things. Because in the commensurate queenside hanging pawn structures, advancing the pawns has no downside generally. You want those pawns to be mobile to create a hanging pawn or a pass pawn or something like that. Here, the fact that the king, that's the pawn cover for the king. So advancing either of these pawns has the additional downside of exposing the black king. So there's some additional tactical stings that both sides have to pay attention to. But generally the same positional features. Basically, white's going to set up to pressure these hanging pawns with pieces. And he's going to try to get one of these pawns to advance. Now here, like we said, the pawn cover for the king, so there's that added downside. Another point is that there's no pawn break that can be generated with these hanging pawns. In the equivalent queenside hanging pawn structures that we've been looking at, the d4 push would always generate a passed pawn, because there would be a pawn in this situation, d3. But there's no pawn break generated by advancing these pawns. There's no extra activity being generated for the black position by opening up a file. It's just a pawn advance. So really, the e-pawn is theoretically strong because it's passed, but we'd almost prefer this white pawn on d5 to be back on d3 because e4 would generate a pawn break and potentially open up some lines for black. Here, there's no such lines being opened up, and either of these pawn moves would just generate weaknesses. So I think this is slightly better for white. I don't want to overstate white's advantage, but this is the sort of advantage that Petrosian was legendary for massaging. He's just going to slowly milk the position and improve things step by step. So bishop h5, this is a nice little detail, just hitting the rook first. Put it in a slightly less flexible position. Bishop d1, that was the ultimate point. I think g3 is a little bit more accurate here. Just putting a barrier up in front of the f4 push. And this is a little bit better for white. The e4 square is owned by whites. Bishop on g7 is a little bit unhappy with the pawn being on e5. Bishop d1. Knight d7 is correct here. So the knight on c5 looks nice, but it doesn't actually achieve anything. So it's important to get that knight back to a point where it's actually contributing better. So it's headed for the d6 square, where it's pressuring this pawn on c4. Excuse me. d6. Knight e4. I like this little. This line will come up later as well, foreshadowing. But knight e4. I like that move. And this looks even right now. The hanging pawns are being defended nicely so far. And black can think about advancing them at the correct time. He's got the correct F-file support for a quick F4, F3 push. But queen d6 a little bit too passive. Bishop c2. So this step of bishop h5, bishop d1, bishop c2, it's all to get this bishop on the appropriate diagonal to contribute in the fight against these hanging pawns. So Petrosian is right on point here. This is exactly how you want to arrange your pieces against a hanging pawn. Get them bombarding the hanging pawns with pressure. King h1. This is a normal tuck-away move that strong players routinely make. White's advantage is not transient. It's not a short-term advantage. It's not like a lead in development or an initiative against the king that's in danger of going away. White's advantage is more or less permanent. These pawn weaknesses are there to stay. So white can afford to make a quick timeout move to just make that little improving move. Part of the improving as a chess player is having the instincts to know when you can afford to make a small improving move like that. And Petrosian was sort of the king of knowing when to make those quiet improving moves. Rook a8. This is the first real clear error of the game. We've had some quibbles here or there, but there's just no justification for the hanging pawns. That's the theater of battle. There's nothing going on that a rook on a8 can deal with. That's just a clear error. Knight b7 was correct. Rerouting that knight to somewhere else. h5. This is a useful move in a lot of variations, because a lot of times g4 will be an important pawn break for white. It's analogous to the b pawn break against the hanging pawns on the queen side. It's a little bit more double-edged because white's king is behind that break, but it also exposes black's king. So it's a more tactically double-edged move, but potentially the rewards are higher because you could play for checkmate. So h5 actually restrains that g4 break a little bit long-term, which I do like. And then queen g6, and then the knight's going to come to d6. And this is comfortable enough for black. I think white's a little bit better, but this is still perfectly fine. But rook a8 is just a clear error. It just completely misplaces that rook. Rook e2 was played. This is sort of a typical quiet Petrosian move. g4 was correct here. And again, this is completely analogous to the b pawn break that you see against the queenside hanging pawns. f4. If f takes, this shows the tactical justification. Queen d3, just threatening queen g6 check. d6, just crashing through. Again, the rook on a8 makes no sense, and especially in a position like this, it looks like a humongous error to have this rook on a8. More or less, all of this is forced. And this is completely over. So f takes is exactly what white is looking for. It's the tactical justification for playing g4. Just rips open the black king at a time where he's down material because the rook's stuck on a8. So f4 is forced, but this allows a grip in the position for white. And this is very nice. Notice that queen x c4, this is incredibly dangerous. This is just one line that I go over. The king can't take back, because white's just going to mate down the exposed kingside files here. So in this position, black just needs to do something like queen e7. But that would be a very comfortable position for white. He owns the light squares, and it's exactly analogous to the b pawn break against queenside hanging pawns, and that's exactly what you want to achieve with that pawn break. Black gets that passed pawn, but white owns so many of these squares it's positionally worth it. Especially so that it leads to an exposed black king at the end of this. So rook e2, it's not bad, but white could play for more. Queen f8. Black would just be better off admitting the mistake and moving that rook back. Rook ef2. Queen e2. Knight b5. A little bit better way of going. It's not crucial, but this would be a little bit better way of going about, because now bishop c3 is going to be the follow-up, and then you have both these bishops bombarding the hanging pawns. Plus the knight in b5 is a little bit more active. So queen e2, it's not a bad move, just knight b5 was a little bit more incisive. 6, c5. So this is thematic. It's a common King's Indian pawn break for white, so this isn't necessarily bad or anything. White does have better, though. And this is actually, I didn't see this move in any of the literature in this game. This is a game that Kasparov looked at in his My Great Predecessor series, and a couple other people analyzed it. I didn't see anyone look at this move. So when I first found this move and analyzed it and looked at it for a little bit, I was a little bit in disbelief, because it's just such a silly move. It invests a whole piece. But it absolutely works. So f4 is actually the best move. If black takes, and just to highlight this silly quiet move, bishop d2, so the knight is pinned. The rook on a8 is just completely stranded. So white has time to just make this quiet move of bishop d2, and then he's just going to follow it up with queen x e4, and then mate on h7. As simple as you please. Bishop a8, h8 is the best defense, just to bring this queen to g7. And then c5, this is an important follow-up. So now the light square bishop is going to reroute to amplify the pin pressure on this knight on f7. And c5 is just in time enough to stop the knight from hopping to d6. d6. Notice if the knight takes, just bishop b3 check, or, well, the rook's also hanging. It's probably a little bit better. But rook f8 is forced. And then these next few moves are more or less all forced. And this ends with white has 3 pawns for the piece. One of those pawns is this humongous pawn on c7. The black king is still exposed. This is a humongous advantage for white. So as far as I can tell, there are a couple alternatives for black, but as far as I can tell, f takes e4 is more or less just winning. So f4 is forced. And then this is just a very simple advantage for white. You know, he hasn't even had to play that slightly weakening g4 push to provoke f4 from black. White can just play this position for free. You know, white owns the e4 outpost. He owns the light squares now with his outrageously strong bishop on c2. White can just play this forever, and he can always break with g3 at the appropriate moments. This is fantastic for white. So as far as I can tell, this knight e4 move actually works, and I invite someone to prove me wrong, because it is an outlandish-looking move. But as far as I can tell, it does work. But c5, there's nothing wrong with it. Bishop takes, rook b8, b3, g4. It's just like against the queenside hanging pawns, this g-pawn break, it's important to look at it every moment. f4 is more or less the only move. And this is actually balanced. So white's grip in the light squares is balanced out by this weak g-pawn. Black now has counterplay in the b-file, which is also important. And this queen on f7 is actually pretty well placed. It's attacking this isolated pawn on d5. It's there in the king side to take advantage of the white king if necessary. So b3, it's sort of the quiet way of going, just closing down this b-file. Queen c8. So this is another mistake. This is in the same vein of that rook a8 mistake. It's just completely moving the queen away from the important part of the board. You know, the hanging pawns are what matters. e4 is the best move. It's the most logical. Now that b3 has been played, opening up this long diagonal has extra benefits. It's hitting this loose knight on c3. 4. And white is still better here. You know, white's got a nice grip on key squares now, and he can hope to move this knight to f4 at some point after like g3 and rook g1. But black still has some play here. This is still doing okay for black. Queen c8, just misplacing the black queen. Queen h5, g4 also works. Or the main line I give. Black has some play here, but this is a pawn, and white is still well posted for an assault on the king side. Queen a6, this is another mistake, just completely misplacing the black queen. Now the black queen doesn't even have a way to get back to the king side. g4, so this finally comes, and this is, just like against the queenside hanging pawns, this is always one of the key breaks that you want to be looking at. Pawn breaks are always the soul of the position, so white is perfectly placed for this g-pawn break now. It looks dangerous because that's your king that's being exposed as well, but that's black's king that's being exposed too. If e4, white just takes. White's just crashing through. G-file's open, queen g6 is a threat, or g1's a threat. This is just winning. So f4 tries to keep things closed. Rook e1, rook g1's better, but Petrosian is just playing slow. He's looking at this e4 grip, playing for checkmate generally a little bit better. But queen c8, getting the queen back. Bishop d6, and the bishop d6, the Petrosian actually gave this an exclamation mark when it's clearly a mistake, and it actually gives away most of white's advantage. Queen g6 is just winning, and it's hard to say what Petrosian missed here. And white's pieces are just invading with decisive effect. Bishop d6, it solidifies black's pawns, it gives up a very useful bishop, plus it's just tactically losing. Cx d6, this gives white a chance. Just taking in g4, it drops a pawn. And white has compensation. So he's got the strong knight on e4, this bishop on c2 is still strong, he's got the open g-file against black's king. But a pawn is a pawn, and I think white is the one that needs to prove something here. Cx d6, white plays bishop g6. This is even worse than the previous note, because after rook f8, f3, this is more or less the final mistake of the game, and this is time trouble. As I've mentioned a few times, back in the day, the time control was at move 40. There used to be what's called time controls, where you'd have time added once you reach the 40th move. So at this point, both sides were in dire time pressure, most likely, since we're a few moves before move 40. Bishop g4 is just clear here, just grabbing that pawn. Not only grabbing the pawn, but it prevents the g-file from being opened with the pawn break g5. So without that pawn break, black's king is much safer, but also a pawn is a pawn. Now f3, now that the pawn's off the board. And black's just, I would say, almost on the verge of winning. Yeah, black's just a pawn up. This pawn on f3 completely seals up any attacking chances. Black's actually more active at this point because all these pieces are just sort of sealed up. f3 just, I don't know why Suetin, time pressure, but g5. So white immediately regrets leaving that pawn alive. Now that g-file's breaking open. Rook f4, that's a poor choice. Bishop g4. Doing a better defensive job. Queen d8. Black is trying to hold here. Notice that queen takes. The tactical point is that the bishop on g6 is suddenly trapped. But rook f4, this should just get crushed. Rook g. Petrosian was one of the best blitz players of all time, so even in time pressure, it's sort of incredible to see him make a mistake like this. Just open the g-file. Just the black king is exposed. Open the primary artery to reach him. 4, queen g5. Yeah, it's hard to say what Petrosian missed here. It looks like a direct win because you're getting that direct access to the black king. Bishop f5. This is a huge mistake in return. Just bishop g4. I just give a quick variation. And this is still messy. So white does have some stuff for the queen. But this, certainly black is the one pressing. The worm is completely turned. Black is certainly the one with the advantage here. Bishop f5 just allows things to get opened up in white's favor. So gx h6, white doesn't miss his chance again. And Suetin resigned here, because now the g-file is opened up, rook g7 is coming, this is completely lost. But some amazing twists and turns there towards the end. But really the whole logic of the game is much earlier. So this initial transition to hanging pawns. We've talked so much about when it's appropriate transition to hanging pawns. Notice here that white's entire position is well suited to take on these hanging pawns. Both the rooks are lined up. White has this maneuver to get his bishop to c2 to aim at them. After that, he can try to maneuver other pieces to get to that, but he also always has that g-pawn break to open things up. White's position is quite well suited to take on these hanging pawns. So I wanted to give this game as an example, as sort of an idealized example of how to take on the hanging pawns in terms of piece maneuvering, because Petrosian was a master of piece maneuvering, so I want you to give extra attention to how he reorganized his position to face these hanging pawns. But also that g-pawn break, so he was a little bit shy in making that g-pawn break, and he had several opportunities to do so, but eventually that was the star of the game, that g-pawn break. And just like it's analogous to the b-pawn break against queenside hanging pawns, always be looking at your pawn breaks, no matter what structure you're in, but especially in hanging pawns. Often, that g-pawn break or that b-pawn break against hanging pawns, it's going to be the key to the position. So when you're maneuvering your minor pieces, keep in mind that that pawn break is what you want to be ultimately preparing for, whether it's to support it or to set up your piece to take advantage of the pawn sacrifice that results. And even though there's some twists or turns at the end, Petrosian eventually ended up taking advantage of the kingside lines that opened up because of that g-pawn break. So, excellent game from Petrosian. So we're going to do one more roundup video, and then that'll do it for hanging pawns. We're going to move on to something a little bit more aggressive and fun after this. But my name is John. I'll see you then.